This is Pantheon Plus, a podcast where we go beyond tights and flights to explore other genres and movies from the past. Each month we'll have a theme, and this month we're on the road again for the Road Trip Month. Each week we'll pick a road trip movie, and this week we look at 1988's Midnight Run.
Robert De Niro does the shooting.
Don't move, I'll shoot you right through the glass.
Charles Grodin does the complaining.
This is not good.
They're the best friends
Glad to see me.
that ever wanted to kill each other.
You get it started, and I'll run you over.
From the director of Beverly Hills Cop
Under different circumstances, probably still would have hated each other.
Midnight Run, rated R. Special sneak preview Saturday night.
My name is Brian DeBrain, and you can find me on Twitter at Brian DeBrain. You can find additional episodes of this podcast through Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and all your favorite podcast apps through the real world. We strongly encourage you to leave a 4 or 5 star review so as people to help discover the show and the great work that the folks at the real world are doing. If you would like to interact with us or send feedback, you can do so by following us on Twitter at Hero Pantheon. And my co-host for this week and every week this month will be Jerome Q-Son. He can be found on Twitter at JeromeC1985. This week I picked a movie that both of us had not seen before, so it's kind of an interesting take, a fresh take on an 80s movie. So it was really interesting because both of us had heard so many good things about this movie. It's not really like an Academy award-winning kind of big movie at the time. In fact, it hardly had any like nominations at all. But the legacy between the chemistry of these two characters and the comedy and the fact that a buddy action comedy road trip movie is kind of unique for the 80s at the time. So it really stands out, and I think what really stands out especially is Robert De Niro doing his comedy, because we all know that he's this hard badass. We know him as the mafia guy in every Martin Scorsese movie almost, and he does have these comedy bits. And then when he does comedy, like lately he's been doing the bad grandpa shtick, and it's not as funny. But him in his prime doing comedy with like these catchy one-liners, and him being mad all the time and saying 100 fuck words and all that kind of thing, and then to compare it with Charles Grodin, who's doing this performance where he's kind of restricted and held back, but it's almost like he's calm and calculated. He's almost kind of like an accountant, like a Robin Hood type accountant, where he stole from the mafia rich and gave to the poor. So it creates this interesting dynamic, and I for one was just laughing almost the whole time, just because I felt like something about Robert De Niro in this movie was just, I don't know, he was on another level. And even when they're being chased by the cops, he's still be able to be funny. And I'm just not used to that from Robert De Niro. I'm just used to him just being annoyed, mad, and killing people.
I think there have been a number of comedies that I've seen with Robert De Niro that have either not been funny or just not delivered. And there have even been some movies I've liked, like Silver Linings Playbook, where I just have not liked Robert De Niro's performance in it. And I think he's been very up and down over the course of the last 20 years. And there are certainly times when it feels like he is just doing a movie for the paycheck and for no other reason. And it's unfortunate because I think you go back to this time in 1988, and I think Robert De Niro was undoubtedly in the prime of his career. And I mean, you look at the decade of the 70s and the 80s, and you look at the movies that Robert De Niro did. I mean, it's a Hall of Fame career just for that. I mean, Mean Streets, Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, Once Upon a Time in America, The King of Comedy. These are pretty iconic movies, and even after this, Robert De Niro would be in a number of movies that are recognized and very popular. Goodfellas, Casino, Heat. I mean, so there was still a lot of juice left after this. So we're in a time when Robert De Niro was not necessarily doing a lot of comedies, but I think that you get this persona, and I think that one of the things that you can see about Martin Brest and the way that he directs his actors is that he is able to really hone in on what they can do, and that's what he emphasizes in his movies, because I think there are times when this does feel similar to Beverly Hills Cop, but this movie is also very different in that it doesn't feel as if as much of the movie was improv, and perhaps there was some between Charles Grodin and Robert De Niro, but it definitely felt like a lot of the comedy was either in the script or it was something that was emphasized by the director. And that is not to, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, because ultimately I think there's some really good actors who are good comedic actors because they follow the script. And I think that's how, at least how it came across. I may be wrong on that, but to me that's it came off more like De Niro was acting in this movie than trying to be funny. And I think him being funny was just a byproduct of his performance and of the direction.
Yeah, because even on the notes, like I was looking this up, and I guess George Gallo had a decent script, even though Charles Grodin said he said it was one of the best scripts he's ever written or read. But I can tell, like, there's just it's more on the delivery by the actors. I think it seems like the dialogue would have been totally generic, coming off like a any other actor, I think. But De Niro just takes it to the next level, and because he can elevate certain lines, and the way he says the way he says fuck is just funny as hell. Like, I don't know what it is, but even in like the Scorsese movies, when he's going off on these rants, when he's mad and he says fuck a lot, it's just you can't help but laugh. So maybe there's something to that, because the way that this movie was put together by Martin Brest and George Gallo, the writer, it seemed like Martin Brest had to really sculpt and shape the script to what we see on the screen, because a lot of people were kind of questioning the script at first, because like if you see like the way that he portrays the mob people, it's very generic. There's nothing really interesting about the mob people other than they're just drug dealers, and then there's an interesting performance by Dennis Farina. But other than that, very by the numbers. Even I would say the Bond people, Joe Pantoliano. I mean, he was just kind of on one set the whole time. But I don't know. I don't think if Martin Brest directed it the way he did it, it wouldn't have been as funny. And I think a different director would have taken a different approach. But because he had that balance that he took from Beverly Hills Cop, where he balanced that action and comedy, he was able to do it here. And I think he was the right fit for this movie. Because if you got a purely comedy director, I think they would have tried it way too hard, and it would have been a little bit of a miss. You know what I mean? But right when they, I think finding that balance, and whenever you have a writer who's kind of like, ambitious, you know what I mean? Like an example is that Superman movie, that documentary we talked about. Kevin Smith had a crazy script, but he needed like a Tim Burton type of director to kind of shape it all together into something that you can kind of visually digest. You know what I mean? So there's something about this script that seemed very generic, but the way that Martin Brest kind of took it and shaped it and put in the right actors, it made it a level above. So I got to give credit to them, because it seemed like any other actors would have fell flat. You know what I mean? And just De Niro like fit this role specifically, especially since he actually went on like drug raids and like bonds raids and stuff like that with actual cops and bounty hunters to get that feel. So he did his research, man, and we know De Niro always goes out and fully researches his role. He gained like 50, 60 pounds for both Untouchables and Raging Bull in the 80s, so we know he's willing to go full out for the role. So I think that really helped the performance a lot. A little interesting note here is that it was originally going to be produced by Paramount. De Niro wanted to, he wanted to star in it, but at the time, De Niro just made Untouchables. So he wanted to do some comedy to kind of, balance it out, because Untouchables was such a hard, serious movie. You know what I mean? If you've never seen Untouchables, go check it out. It's one of the best 80s gangster movies, or one of the best gangster movies of all time, actually. So Penny Marshall actually approached him to play the role of Tom Hanks in Big. So I thought that was interesting, because we mentioned that last week. Around this time, a lot of people wanted Tom Hanks in these kind of roles. So, or even Robert De Niro in this case. But, unfortunately, Penny Marshall had already cast Tom Hanks in the role. So, he was still looking for a comedy to do. So he stumbled upon this script that I guess Universal took over, because they wanted to keep De Niro in it. And then they test screened Charles Grodin, and the producers loved it. So Universal took the property and produced it themselves. Paramount wanted some bigger names. And of course, we talked about that with Planes, Trains, and Automobiles last week. They wanted some bigger names for the marquee, but the producers felt that the test audition between Gruden and De Niro was just so good that they had to stick with that combo, and Universal was willing to stick with that combo, so that's why they went with Universal. I mentioned De Niro worked as went with some bounty hunters and some police officers to actually get that feel for the role. Another interesting note is George Gallo actually based the relationship between Jack and Duke on his parents. So when you see these scenes of them just arguing, and you see this total like opposite end of the spectrum, where you got Charles Grodin being this calm, calculated, trying to figure out the right thing to say and not try to yell and scream at De Niro all the time. And De Niro is just like the opposite, where he He has no patience. He's angry all the time. He's yelling and screaming at him all the time. So it was very much, you can tell like which one was like the mom and the dad. You know what I mean? And that dynamic worked a lot because by the end they kind of, despite how much they hated each other in the middle, they came to like each other at the end, and that's usually that's what usually happens in a buddy cop road trip movie kind of thing. So it's to be expected, but the way that they built the relationship in the middle and in the beginning, I thought was really well done.
One of the things that you mentioned was this idea of taking scripts written by different people and how they get distilled by directors. And I think that I look at an Aaron Sorkin over the last 10 years or so, and two of the movies that got produced that he wrote were The Social Network and Moneyball. And I think by having two other directors in those taking care of those movies, I think you really distilled the best aspects of Aaron Sorkin, because I think Aaron Sorkin has some very problematic elements, and I feel like the right directors have been able to kind of hide those things and really bring out the best in those scripts. And I think that is the case here, is that you have George Gallo write the script, and ultimately you don't know kind of what got taken out, what was kept in, but Martin Brest was able to kind of take the best elements of that script and retain it, and you've got these two performers who are pretty much at the peak of their powers. Robert De Niro is arguably in his prime, and Charles Grodin is somebody who I think people have almost forgotten about, unfortunately, but Charles Grodin has been in a number of movies and television shows, and I think that what he brings to the table is he brings a very dry a sense of humor, and it's very quiet. If you were to compare this to John Candy's performance in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, it's almost like you're dealing with a very different character. And I think even if you compare this to other road trip characters, because in a lot of cases when you have these buddy road trip movies, you kind of have the straight-laced guy and you have the wild and crazy guy. Well, what makes this movie so different is that Robert De Niro is kind of the protagonist and kind of the one who has a clear purpose, and he's actually the one that's acting crazy. And I think we're supposed to think that that the Duke is kind of the crazy one because of what he did, but in this case the roles were kind of reversed, and I think it really plays out well. And I think that just the banter between the two and the way that they were able to play off of each other, I think the personalities really fit. And in a movie like this, you really need your two lead performers to have good chemistry, because if you end up with a road trip movie and the two people or the family or whomever, if there's no chemistry there, then the movie's not going to be very good. And I think there are a couple of examples of that. I mean, I think Robert Downey Jr. and Zach Galifianakis did a road trip movie a few years ago, and I don't think that movie was nearly as good because there was just something missing with the chemistry. And in this case, I think that it's certainly, I'm not going to say it's a perfect comedy, but I think that there are so many entertaining scenes. It is both funny, but the plot is also engaging. I also love the running gag involving the FBI. And Brian, 1988 was not a good year for the FBI.
No, it was not. And that son.
Do you know why? Do you know why it wasn't a good year for the FBI?
Go on, Mr. History Teacher.
Die Hard.
Oh, okay.
Johnson?
Well, okay. Okay. I thought you were talking about real life problems, but because the FBI has always been fucked up. But
I mean, that is a very different podcast. But in cinema, 1988, between this movie and Die Hard, the FBI just looks incompetent. And for the most part, if you actually do look at history, the FBI is very incompetent.
yeah, they can. The whole thing with the sunglasses in this movie was great because it's the little bits like that kind of make you laugh and like, oh yeah, the sunglasses. And running gags are great in movies, and the fact that they were able to do this very well. So, yeah, you talk about Charles Grodin and like not people remembering him. I remember him as the villain from the Muppet. I think the Muppet sequel, the one where they go to England and he steals the diamond and blames Miss Piggy. So that's what I remember him, and I remember him as the Beethoven dad, the dad from Beethoven. So I'm used to Charles Grodin. The way I'm used to seeing him is like either he's being a manipulative bad guy, which he was great in that Muppets movie, or being this, this dad that's about to lose his lid because he's so pissed off at the dog, right? In this case, I just didn't know what to expect because I thought going into this movie they were going to be yelling and screaming at each other the whole time. But Charles Grodin was hardly yelling and screaming. He was calm, and that was the point of it all. It's because it was this contrast that Martin Brest created, and I thought he did it very well because I don't know. I just fully expected them to be yelling and screaming the whole like 2 hours, but the way that they built it up like slowly, stuff. When he's on the plane and Charles Grodin's making up that thing about him being afraid of the plane and everything like that, and he's just like losing it, and he's faking it, but like he's working Robert De Niro, but just this little things like that, you know what I mean? And then it just builds up and builds up, and then I just felt like as the movie goes on, it actually gets better and better with the little plot twists here and there, and then they add more characters and more complications, and the fact that we actually saw Jimmy Serrano, excuse me, halfway through the movie, I thought that was a good twist because I didn't expect him to see in the movie at all because it just didn't feel like, well, it's not really his story, but it ended up being a bigger story in the end. So I thought just the that dynamic and tying everything together, and then just the stakes get higher and higher, and then you're at this point where in the movie they're being chased on a helicopter by the mob, and they're running through the desert, and you got John Ashton there who was the cop from Beverly Hills Cop 1 and 2, so because he's friends with Martin Brest, so he's having a ball here and in this character actor role, and just him being dirty and a bounty hunter, and I thought he did a good job. And then you see the scene, and they're all in the desert, and they're right, and they're in the car, and then Robert De Niro's just like, "Shut the fuck up," because Charles Grodin won't shut up. Oh my god, that was tremendous, that whole sequence. So they did a really good job of putting like the chemistry together because I feel like this movie's just based on chemistry. Any other, I think De Niro was the perfect guy for this because he takes these roles seriously. So, interesting to note that De Niro actually, came off Untouchables, as I mentioned, and in Untouchables, it was Al Capone's accountant that testified against him to take down the mob in a big racketeering thing. And in this case, he's actually doing the opposite, where he's protecting the accountant so the accountant can take down the mob boss for racketeering. So I thought that was really interesting. And then, but at the end of the movie, when they're trying to, put this whole plan together and take down Jimmy Serrano or whatever, and his mob crew, like the way that he's talking about it sounds almost like the way that Kevin Costner and the crew took down Al Capone in Untouchables. Man, I thought that was really interesting. So if you're a big mob boss out there, protect your accountants, man, because they can really take you down.
I mean, isn't that what The Dark Knight was all about too? At least the first half was Batman was trying to find the accountant for the mob.
God damn it, you're right again, Jerome. I guess this is just like the trope. I don't know what it is, but
I mean, this is how you get them. You're never going to get them on murdering and all that stuff because they're too good at it, but you get some good financial scam and some racketeering and some RICO going, and this is how it works. This is how you bust people, Brian, ultimately.
yeah, it's just I guess it works because it is a compelling thing because usually the accountant of a mob boss is usually not the guy that's going to kill you. You know what I mean? So
Absolutely. And the one thing I will say, you talked about John Ashton, and if I had not just watched Beverly Hills Cop, I think John Ashton would have been almost unrecognizable in this role because it's very obvious that he put on some weight, and he's just the skeeziest, dirtiest guy in the world. Like, just even the food that he eats just looks disgusting and repulsive, and it's great. I mean, I love him in this role. He's so perfect for it, and I think that there's a very real scenario where after Beverly Hills Cop 2, this is what happens to him as a person in life. So I was tremendously amused by that. And I mean, what else do you say about Joey Pants? He's probably, I don't want to say the greatest, but he's definitely top tier of character actors, that anything that he does is automatically elevated by his presence. And there are so many movies where he is the straw that stirs the drink. And I even think about the original Matrix movie, and I think the reason that movie works is because of the Joey Pants character. And there are other movies as well. Bad Boys is tremendous, and I think a lot of it is because of Joey Pants. And I mean, here he's also very skeezy, and I mean, just the clothing just gets across what a weirdo he is, and God, I love this performance, and the thing about it is that most of his performance, he's on the phone talking to other characters, and that is not something that's easy because he doesn't really have a lot of people to play off of. But I mean, he's just so good at it. He's just so good in this movie, and I think that is what makes a movie like this work, is that it is the charisma of the performers that gets across what works. And I think sometimes we overthink movies in a lot of cases. I think we try to think about the plot elements and the cinematography and the writing, and sometimes it just comes down to what makes a movie successful. Do I have a charismatic lead? Do I have the right people in these roles? And I think sometimes that your movie or television show can get carried by this fact. And I certainly think The Midnight Run is well directed by Martin Brest, but part of the reason that I think that is because I think Martin Brest just hones in on the strengths of John Ashton and Joe Pantoliano and Robert De Niro and Charles Grodin, and just kind of lets them do their thing, and that's why the movie works.
Yeah, so what really works, let's go on to that. And you mentioned it already. Just we already mentioned the strong performances by Charles Grodin and Robert De Niro, but you mentioned Joe Pantoliano, and just this movie is just filled with great character actors. And I know we don't really mention a lot of character actors a lot, but I think in the next 2 weeks we'll probably talk about it a lot, especially with Brian Dennehy coming up next week playing Chris Farley's dad. But there's something about character actors where you mentioned John Ashton putting on the weight. But I do remember this quote. I forgot where I read it, but it was from Brian Dennehy saying, "You're a character actor. You can put on as much weight as you want, and they're still going to hire you because you're a character actor. You're not the main guy." So thinking about that, you can have a lot of fun with these side characters, and you can tell they had a lot of fun here with these side characters. And Dennis Farina, tremendous actor. He's this hard ass, and I remember him especially from Get Shorty and then Law and Order later on. But I didn't even know that. I guess in real life he was a cop. I mean, did you know that?
Yes, I did know that Dennis Farina was a cop. It was a big deal when he took over for Jerry Orbach on Law and Order.
Holy shit! And not only that, but the whole Chicago tie-in again. He was a former Chicago policeman, and Chicago is one of the central cities in this movie as well. But yeah, just strong performances throughout. And I think a movie like this, you need great character actors. And I don't know. I think in today's world, we probably should have more focus on that. But we'll see. I think something like a Marvel MCU, I think they probably need a little bit more character actors, because they usually right now with like MCUs you have these like side roles, but then it's not character actors, it's like starring roles getting these side gigs. So I think we need a comeback of some character actors, but that's just me. And it's probably because I don't watch as much TV.
Oh yeah, all of the character actors are doing HBO and Netflix shows now.
See, that's what the thing is. Like, I'm so used to seeing all these people on the old Law and Order episodes, and they probably are still on the reruns, but it's just a different time now. You know what I mean? Especially with the way we're consuming media. But I do want to see this kind of resurgence in movies. Maybe I'm just missing it, but yeah, character actors are awesome. So, and then what still works about this movie, of course, is the journey. Like we talked about last week, the crazy journey that Dell and Neil Page went through. Same thing here. So basically, De Niro, I think, is started out in L.A., right? And then he goes to New York to get Charles Grodin, and then they go on the plane. Charles Grodin lies about having, being a fear of flying. So they get off the plane. They end up on a train. They get chased off the train by the mob. They end up on a bus. They get chased off the bus again. And then they hitchhike a little bit, and they end up back on another train. And in the meantime, the credit card get canceled. They lose all the money. All the shit that can possibly go wrong goes wrong. Familiar tropes here and there, but the fact that De Niro is just selling it like a fucking madman, and Charles Grodin's like, you should calm down, And then the whole time it's just like Charles Grodin is trying to like keep Jack or Robert De Niro like calm and just like, you shouldn't be smoking, you should calm down. How's your diet? You have a lot of cholesterol in your diet. This whole thing about, that whole relationship that builds up between them during the journey, I thought was tremendous. And by the end of the movie, it's almost like, I don't know if you noticed, but at first, Gruden says, if I were your accountant, and then by the end of the movie, I think he does say, as your accountant.
Yeah, I definitely picked up on that, and I think what's also really great is that that Charles Grodin he mentions this fear of flying, but then he also mentions that at some point he's going to have to give Jack Walsh the slip. And I love the fact that the slip is him getting into an airplane and trying to fly it. It's a great payoff to kind of two running jokes at once, and it serves that double purpose. And it also gives a reason for them to quickly get on a plane, because there's no way they could drive from Vegas to Los Angeles in an hour and a half. But I think it is doable to get a plane ticket and fly from Vegas to Los Angeles. I know that that is a very short flight. So it's a tremendous payoff in the way that they were able to execute those things. I mean, that's kind of what movie making is just you want to set things up in the first act and pay them off in the second and the third act. And I think whenever you're able to do that in a common sense way, it's something that I really notice and acknowledge, because I mean, it's just good storytelling. I think with storytelling, that's kind of what you want to feel with these things, is that things you feel like you're an intelligent viewer who's paying attention, and that you pay attention to something and there's a payoff for it. I mean, if not, then your movie isn't very good. And I think that this movie works because a lot of things make sense. There are a couple of things that don't really make sense, and we'll probably get to those in a couple minutes, but a lot of the script of this movie is relatively tight, and I think for a comedy that does dare to go over 2 hours, you really need this. You really need a tight script, and I think it, especially when it comes down to these two characters, I think it works. And you mentioned the fact that they are on multiple trains. Yes, they are on multiple trains, but the first one is meant for them, and the freight train is not meant for them. And that is also a very funny scene because, again, Duke is trying to give Jack the slip, but Jack is just too good at what he does to be able to fall for the shenanigans. And I love the fact that Jack is generally really smart about how he operates, and even when the Duke says that he has a fear of flying, Jack really, like, it has to go to extreme levels for Jack to believe him. And I don't necessarily know if he even believed him after they were pulled off the plane. He seemed more annoyed than anything else. So you've got this world-weary former cop who's dealt with a lot of corruption. It's pretty fantastic.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that works about his character too is the fact that we find out halfway through the movie that Jimmy Serrano planted drugs in his house and gave him an ultimatum saying, you either take the payoffs or you're going to go down for having these drugs in your house. And he ran him out of town. And not only that, he ran him out of town without his wife and kid, to the point where I guess the wife married a corrupt cop, and that just fucking made things worse. And then you see the daughter there. And I love that scene with the daughter and how the daughter tries to give, her life savings to her father because he hadn't seen him in a while, and the father needs money, and he's like, no, of course not. Save your money. I thought that was a really touching moment, man, and I felt like they could have done a little bit more with that, but they kind of went away from that towards the end. I thought maybe they had some resolution towards that, but they kind of, I guess, just avoided that altogether. They just, parted ways, and that was the end of the movie, and we never got a follow-up on that. But I did like that. I thought that played really well. Because it really, especially like the fact that he talks about the watch that his wife gave him, right? And this ties into that thing you were talking about earlier about payoffs. So basically, he explains a story, and he made it up himself, and he used it in the movie, and Martin Brest loved it. But his watch is always going to be 30 minutes ahead of time because he used to be late all the time. So his wife got him the watch and set it 30 minutes ahead of time, right? So when he lands in L.A. with Charles Grodin, it's not midnight or whatever it was. He's 30 minutes early. And that was the whole point of it. So I don't know if you picked up on that as well, but I thought that was a really, really well done little full circle touch they did there.
Yeah, it was very good, and the fact that he gives the Duke the watch, I think, is a very nice touch. Obviously meant to be this very emotional moment because they've connected with one another and have gone through an experience that neither one of them will likely go through again. I mean, it's a pretty crazy 24 hours or 48 hours, and this is not something they're really going to go through ever again. So you got to give the screenwriters and the directors credit for paying this off in a really, really interesting fashion. And that the stuff with the wife was weird, and it felt like it was a little bit underdeveloped, and I don't think they quite knew what they wanted to do with that part of it. I think the scene with the daughter is very emotional, and it feels like it is this cathartic moment. but I think that one of the issues with the scene in a macro sense is the idea that she was forced to marry this corrupt cop, or did she do it willingly and has regrets about it? I wish that that had been made a little bit more clear, because the argument that they have really doesn't go into a lot of depth, and I think that's part of the issue with having those kinds of arguments, is that the only reason you would have them say what actually happened is because of exposition and explaining to the audience. But it was a little bizarre and a little weird that we didn't get a full picture of their marriage, why it broke up, and why his now ex-wife is married to such a corrupt police officer.
Yeah, that probably ties into the fact that it's 2 hours, and we talked about how 90 minutes we think is perfect, but this is kind of like a mix of both crime and comedy. So I think 2 hours is perfect. You add a little more of that. You're looking at 2 hours and 15 minutes, but it is what it is. Editing. You have to make those choices. So one last thing I want to mention on what still works is this score was done by Danny Elfman, and I totally unrecognizable. It doesn't even sound like the joke Danny Elfman theme that they play on Family Guy. You wouldn't even recognize it. It's like a country rock kind of soundtrack, and it works, man, because it's got this road trip feel to it. But I don't know, man. Is this the most unrecognizable Danny Elfman soundtrack ever?
Yeah, it's. I think you're used to Danny Elfman scores having a very specific sound. You look at all the collaborations with Tim Burton. You look at even the Justice League theatrical cut has kind of a very Danny Elfman feeling score to it. But I mean, it really was just so different than anything else. And I don't know about you, but there were definitely moments that it felt a little Blues Brothers to me, and there was even a car chase that reminded me a little bit of the Blues Brothers as well. I don't know if there was a kind of a John Landis influence on Martin Brest, but I definitely was watching this movie and was thinking to myself, there are definitely those moments where this reminds me of the Blues Brothers, right down to some of the musical choices and the way that it sounds. But I do appreciate the fact that it just sounds so unrecognizable compared to what he has done in the past, and I think it was kind of welcome, because sometimes Danny Elfman, you get into these composers' filmographies, and a lot of it can feel the same sometimes, but this was just obviously very much at the beginning of his career. I don't even know. I know that Beetlejuice came out the first year, the same year that this did, and I'm not sure like the relationship and when this happened, but it was very different, but it still worked.
I don't know. I mean, maybe it's the John Williams effect and the Hans Zimmer effect, where people rely too much on what they know, and that's why some of the soundtracks start sounding familiar. But in this case, I think Danny Elfman took the right chance for it, and good for him, because he's kind of been this joke, not in a bad way, but this joke of like this. I call it Mickey Mousing around, that kind of feel. So I'm glad that he didn't do that, because that would not have fit this movie at all. Let's kind of go down to what doesn't work. We mentioned the stuff with the wife. I'm not sure if they left it open ended and on purpose, or I don't know. Maybe they just didn't want to place blame on the wife too much. And I totally understand that, because we don't know the situation and what her situation was marrying the cop. Did she even know the cop was corrupt or anything like that? But it's just unfortunate, because you felt like there's something missing there, and we just kind of want to fill that in. But because the drama was so good in that moment, it just felt like, I'll give us more of that. You know what I mean? Especially with the daughter. Another thing that I've noticed, God, I mean, this is just in general, 60s, 70s, 80s movies, even 50s, smoking everywhere. And I don't know, it felt like every scene Robert De Niro was smoking a cigarette, and even Charles Grodin is making fun of it. Yeah, no way this is going down in a movie in 2020. Unless it's like making fun of smoking cigarettes in general, or you just have one of these characters that is just, a representation of that era, and it's something, like a social commentary. In this case, it's just, making it normal and normalizing it. And then, I don't know. I don't even know if he can smoke on planes anymore. But the fact that they asked him for a John Ashton, a smoking or non-smoking scene on a flight, blown away. Blown away. Blown away.
Why did we ever think smoking was a good idea on a plane? I will never understand that one as long as I live. The restaurant part is bad enough, but the frickin' airplane, I can't imagine being on an airplane when somebody decides to smoke. I think it's awful. I mean, I've been on public transportation, on trains especially, when people have smoked, and it is god awful. It is the most disgusting thing in the world. And especially for me, I am very much against cigarettes and smoking tobacco in general, so this is definitely one of my big pet peeves, but there was so much smoking throughout this movie, and it definitely got very noticeable and very annoying after a while. And it almost turned Jack heel in my mind because whenever the Duke would ask him about the cigarettes, I'm like, you know what, Duke, you're absolutely right. Cigarettes are very bad for you, and even in 1988, we knew that. So I was very sympathetic to that. And yes, it's if they ever remake this movie, and I really hope they don't touch this one. I mean, it's bad enough they're remaking Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. I think this would be even. I mean, this would be just so hard to do in because so many road trip movies have come out since, and it would just it'd be really hard. But yeah, smoking bad. Don't do it.
Yeah, and then well, the thing with John Ashton is like there was a running gag with that with the FBI head just stealing his cigarettes every time they meet, and I thought that was hilarious too. But again, it's just the whole smoking thing, and it's just insane. But it is what it is, man. Everyone was smoking. So the other thing that didn't work for me is at the end of the movie. I guess Charles Grodin gives him $300,000, right, as a gift, right? Some of the extra money he stole, and he just had it on him. And when he can be using the money on the road trip, he just didn't use it for some reason. But he gives them $1,000 bills, and I had to research this because I thought I was having some weird Mandela effect or something. Because I remember like the $500 bill in history class, and that was like limited circulation and took that out. But I don't remember a $1,000 bill at all. Jerome remembers this. He knows this. He's a teacher. I just thought that I was just having some kind of clash of timelines where we didn't have the $1,000 bill, and the two timelines were having that Mandela effect and clashing together because I had no idea. And I was like, "Am I looking at this?" And I had to send you the picture. Like, this is a $1,000 bill, right? Is this real? And then you explained it to me like a student. So I feel a little embarrassed, but at the same time, it could be the Mandela effect because God knows that our timeline's screwed up.
I don't know. Maybe it's those damn Legends of Tomorrow that keep doing it. That's what it is, right?
Or Umbrella Academy. Either way, they're screwing something up because, I mean, who has $1,000 bill in the 80s anyway, right?
People who are very rich, which in the 1980s that was definitely a thing. Brian, there's a lot of cocaine going on. You got to keep that in mind too.
I guess so, man. But I was just, I don't know. I guess it works technically in the rich people world, but for me, it's like I'm just so used to seeing $100 bills as like the main currency in every gangster movie. So
I mean, the world of rich people is just completely different than ours. I mean, the New York Times a few weeks ago had an article about them hiring private doctors so that they can throw their parties and they can have like 30-minute COVID tests and shit like that. So it's a completely different world from ours.
apparently, so that's kind of what didn't work for me. I don't know about you. You have anything else to add to that list?
Not really. I think you covered a lot of what doesn't work. I really, really like this movie. I'd never seen it before either, and it's kind of to my shame that I have not. But my goodness, I mean, it was a real pleasure to watch. And even though it was 2 hours long, I mean, it still just worked. I really, really like this movie a lot.
Yeah, I'm hoping to actually find a good Blu-ray copy because I did the streaming and I don't know. I kind of want to own it now because I have this thing about owning old 70s, 80s movies on Blu-ray and just and especially with the 4K stuff that they're producing now and all the color fixing, I'm really excited for some of these old movies coming out. And I hope they do something like this because those desert scenes look really good. I if they kind of like did the 4K treatment for this movie, I think it would look really great. So my MVP, I'm gonna go with Martin Brest. I felt like he took Gallo's script and, like I said, shaped it to what it needed to be. Sometimes you need to have that kind of restraint on writers, and that's why directors and writers sometimes have completely separate roles. Last week we talked about how John Hughes was a triple header, directed, produced, and wrote. This case, you kind of had to divide the work up because, like, if let's say if Gallo decided to do this on his own, I don't think it would be nearly as good. Because if you look at Gallo's like other filmographies and stuff, his movies are not that great. So this is kind of his one. I don't know, 1 out of 50 scripts that is actually good and it was made better by a good director. So I got to give credit to Martin Brest for doing that.
I really wish that I had the case to make for somebody else, but I would agree with you. I think that if nothing else, doing these last two movies as we have done them, I think has given me a new appreciation for him. And we are never going to review Gigli on this podcast, but there's undoubtedly a tremendous story to be written about that. And the other thing that's really strange to me is that Martin Brest has basically disappeared off the face of the earth, and there really hasn't been like a big like where are they now profile. I mean, the last movie he directed was Gigli. He has not directed anything since, and really hasn't been around that much. So it's just weird to me that this person who made these big movies, Beverly Hills Cop, Midnight Run, and Scent of a Woman. I mean, these are big time movies, and Martin Brest is just not around anymore, and it's really, really strange.
I guess Geely will do that to you. I've never actually fully seen Geely. I've seen the clips and they're pretty awful, but I don't know. It just feels like since then he went into hiding or just was like, fuck it, I'm just going to collect residuals for the rest of my life based on the three movies, especially Beverly Hills Cop. I feel like that's still one of those movies that still probably paying out well in terms of residuals considering that it's on TV all the time. So there's got to be something to that. But yeah, best performance, I'm going Robert De Niro, of course. Just tremendous. Right from the start, that scene where the first thing we see him is like he drops the thing that's trying to open the lock and he bends over and all of a sudden they blast the gun through the door and he almost loses his head. Right from the start, man, it just, he got you and he takes you on this journey. So, Charles Grodin was great as well. I almost went with John Ashton based on, by the end, he was just so, like you said, dirty and grimy that he was just so great. But De Niro was just the man in this movie, so.
I know it's shocking that Robert De Niro. If we are reviewing a Robert De Niro movie, then he is probably going to be the best performance, and I think that would hold true even for movies where he's acting against as big of stars. Like even a movie like Heat, I would say Robert De Niro gives the best performance. And I mean the guy's just a legend for a reason, and it's not really it's almost boring to talk about because again we've agreed on this, but I mean he's just fantastic and. At some point, we may get into some other De Niro work, but if not, I mean, Midnight Run is definitely probably an underrated movie in his filmography, just because it is more comedic, but it's actually a good comedic. It's not like Rocky and Bullwinkle or Analyze This, Analyze That, and some of that stuff in the Fockers movies. This is actually good. So yeah, a real pleasure to have finally seen this movie and to have reviewed it. And yeah, I'm glad to say that I've crossed off a number of major pop cultural linchpins that I have not seen, including Breaking Bad, currently watching Better Call Saul, and Midnight Run is right up there too.
Yeah, in terms of the three Martin Brest movies, I would say this is the best one. Number two would be Beverly Hills Cop, and I like Scent of a Woman a lot too. I just feel that movie is just kind of like over the top in terms of the situations and scenarios, but that's a discussion for another time. But Pacino does a great job in that. He won the Oscar anyway, so that's pretty much all the Martin Brest talk we're gonna have on this podcast ever again, maybe, unless we ever talk about Geely, which we're probably never gonna do. So,
Or Meet Joe Black. He also directed Meet Joe Black too.
God, that movie was like 3.5 hours. Wow.
I know, very weird flex and a weird choice.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, because I remember that 2-tape set, and my mom saying it was boring as hell. So, I guess that's it for this week. Next week, we're kind of moving on. We went from 87 to 88. We're going to jump 7 years to 1995. I believe it was March of 95 when this movie came out. It's on TV all the time on the Paramount Network, Tommy Boy. And I feel it's one of the most underrated, underappreciated comedies of the 90s, maybe of all time. It did not get the love it deserved when it first came out because Chris Farley had this, this stigma about being this, it's just physical comedy and just stupid physical comedy guy and all that, people were just used to him from SNL. But I felt like by the end of the movie, he's giving a heartfelt performance. And I think Brian Dennehy lended a hand in that, working some scenes with Chris Farley. So we'll check it out next week. It's one of my favorites, Tommy Boy, another great road trip movie. And some people say, that David Spade hasn't been funny since then, but we'll find out. So,
yeah, David Spade has had a real rough go of it in movies, especially. But yeah, I mean, I think this might be Chris Farley's best movie, and you get the impression that, again, this is a situation very similar to John Candy, where he lost his life before maybe he got really into the prime of his career as far as being funny in movies, and I'm sure we're gonna address that as well. But yeah, this is very funny, and I'm very much looking forward to talking about Tommy Boy next week.
alrighty, for sure. So That wraps up our discussion for this week. Listen next week as we review Tommy Boy. And remember, it's on the Paramount Network all the time. I swear to God, I looked it up. It's just one of those movies that is just on all the time. Even Bravo, which tells you a lot about the type of movie that it evolved into over the last 20 years, which we can talk about next week. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.
See you in the next life, Brian.